Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 382 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today, I have back with me Susan Divers. Susan is a Senior Advisor at LRN, and we discuss LRN's 2018 Program Effectiveness Report, looking at what constitutes program effectiveness, how the Weinstein scandal and Me Too have demonstrated failures in compliance, some of the suggested paths forward, and what you can do to enhance your compliance program. It's a fascinating exploration of the current state of compliance programs and what you can do to move forward. Before we begin, I would like to announce that I have a publication date for my book, The Complete Compliance Solution. It's May 21. It will be available on Amazon.com. If you'd like more information on it, please check out my website, www.fcpacompliancereport.com. You'll see a picture of it on the side, which will give you some detailed information. It is a one-volume handbook on how to design, create, and implement a best practices compliance program. I know you will find it useful. I hope you will check it out. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today because I have with me Susan Divers. Susan is a Senior Advisor with LRN, and we are here to talk about the 2018 Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report. I visited with Susan about this last year, and it was chock full of great information, not only from the sort of retrospective report perspective, but also going forward. This year's report is equally chock full of great information. So I'm thrilled to be able to get Susan back to talk about it, to see some of the things that LRN has seen, their client base, and the marketplace has seen over the last year. So Susan, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, thank you very much for taking the time to visit with me today.
It's my pleasure, Tom. It's always good to talk to you.
Susan, I was really, I would say almost thrilled to see in the report right out of the box in the introduction talking about why check-the-box compliance programs are not effective, and both from the regulatory perspective, from the company perspective, and I think from y'all's perspective as well. But I was wondering why or what you have found that a check-the-box program, which only focuses on policies and procedures, really doesn't work anymore.
Sure, Tom. Well, it's an interesting area to look at, and over the last couple of years, I've looked at it in depth. And as you note, many parts of the ethics and compliance community, including the regulators, have concluded that check the box doesn't work. And one of the early leaders in that area was the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, the ECI. And they came out with a blue ribbon report a couple of years ago, and they said a really interesting thing, and that's that relying on checklists and check the box can give you a false sense of security. And I think you really see that in what's unfolded in the last, at least year, and maybe going back some. Many of the companies that have had sexual harassment problems that have done significant damage to the companies and to individuals had codes of conduct. Many of them had hotlines. Many of them had training. But as you can see from the end result, those programs didn't have traction. So for a compliance officer or even a board of directors or a CEO to rely on having a long checklist of elements as their first defense against risk and reputational damage, I think is just plain foolish.
One of the things that I was really interested in was how LRN quantifies program effectiveness. And you had three general areas, and I really wanted to just ask you to explain, and let's explore those three areas and why you thought they were a critical inquiry.
Sure. Well, what we did last year is we broke new ground in terms of surveys of program effectiveness. Last year I read, I think, in excess of 20 of them before I did the PEI report. and I saw that all of them were focused without exception. The ECI had one survey that was a little bit different, but they were all focused on how often you train people, how often you refresh your code of conduct, whether you have a hotline, how often you brief the board, et cetera. So when I looked at that, we concluded, and it wasn't just me, it was my fabulous colleagues at LRN, we concluded that it was really time for a change and that it was important to look really not at what goes into a program, but what comes out of a program. And when you think about it, the whole point of your investment in ethics and compliance is to change behavior. And it's to build an ethical culture. And so rather than ask people the traditional questions, although we asked some of those, but in a very different context than the other surveys, we asked questions about the culture, and we asked questions about respect. We asked questions about integrity and transparency and organizational justice. And we believe that asking questions about that is a much more significant way to rank programs and to actually evaluate effectiveness.
I was really gratified by the 3 points you raised. The second one, organizational justice, because that is one that I've talked about for a long time, and I've always seen it as critical. But you guys found it as well, and it's organizational justice, not only up and down and kind of left and right, but really throughout the organization and throughout the way that you conduct yourself and you bring your compliance solutions to bear across the organization.
Well, that's exactly right, Tom, and it is an absolutely essential component of an effective program. And some of the reasons for that are that if there is a double standard, if it is known, and it's always known if this is the case in the company, that high flyers get excused from the normal rules that govern conduct in a company, whether that's sexual harassment, whether that's playing fast and loose with their expense reports, whether it's using company assets for their own purpose, and they can do that with impunity, then it basically destroys people's faith in the company. It destroys trust. It clearly is a blow against fairness, and it essentially undermines integrity in that company. And there's a great example today in the Wall Street Journal. It's the saga of the Podesta Group and how it fell apart. And unfortunately, the principal in the Podesta Group basically used the company as his own bank account. And, it's a great example of what can happen when that's the case.
One of the reasons I was so gratified about that was in my last corporate position, now over 10 years ago, we had a situation where individuals in Brazil were fired for cheating on their expense account. And about 2 weeks later, landing on my desk was the same issue from the top salesman in the United States. And I recommended termination. And I said, guys, if we treat those people in Brazil different, it will destroy the credibility of this compliance program. And fortunately, I got overruled. So I saw it in action. And so since that time, I've really tried to talk about organizational justice, consistency, fair process. So I was really gratified that that's now something it's really not you and I making it up. It's bubbling up from what people are telling you guys.
Well, and definitely. And I did a panel at the Global Ethics Summit on how to operationalize your compliance program. And I had very heavy hitter CECOs, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officers, on that panel, and they all said that that is the most difficult issue. And it is, because it's really up to the board and the C-suite to bite that particular bullet. You can be, as you clearly were, a courageous and competent Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, but if you get overruled because that person's bringing in a lot of business, then, there's not much you can really do about that. in the end, and educating boards and CEOs about the corrosive impact of that on the company culture. I mean, you can just see it. I just wrote a blog piece on LinkedIn about this. You can see it in every scandal if you know where to look. And secondly, it's interesting too, I don't know if you found this, but once you start allowing high flyers to sort of break some rules, it's interesting. It seems to create a dynamic where they feel empowered to go on and break more.
I think it's probably more than high flyers if you start with that problem. If you let anybody break the rules, then that becomes part of the culture.
Yeah, that's your sort of broken windows theory of compliance.
So I was wondering now if we could turn to some of the key findings that we see in the executive summary, and if maybe you could just walk us through those.
Sure. I don't have that open right in front of me. Which ones are you?
So we've got, well, I'll just go through them with you. Number one, that values-based ethics and compliance programs work better because the underlying principles, beliefs inform all organizational decisions, not just simply those made in the context of legal or regulatory.
Yeah, and I mean, that really can't be stressed enough. As Melissa Stapleton Barnes, the CEO of Eli Lilly, says, you can't have a rule for every occasion, but you can have a value. And I think in the past, because lawyers have driven the compliance area for a long time, and of course I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer, I think there's been way too much reliance on layers and layers of rules as a way to change behavior. But that's not actually what changes behavior. What changes behavior is a real investment in mission and values. And that is something we've seen in our research at LRN for 25 years. And it not only drives ethical behavior if you invest in values and you mean it, and they inform all operations of the company, but it also drives employee innovation and productivity as well, according to our research.
So another finding was that high-performing organizations outscored other companies by a wide margin when it came to taking concrete steps to operationalize ethics and compliance consistent with the DOJ criteria. And I would have to assume there that we're talking about the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, perhaps even the U.S. sentencing guidelines.
Yes, we are. And one of the innovative things we did this year is after we ranked programs based on output and behavior, we then looked at how they did against a distillation of the February 2017 criteria that were put out in the form of a memo, and Hui Chen, of course, was the author. And interestingly, not surprisingly, we found that companies that stress values, the companies that were high scoring on our evaluation criteria, were the best at operationalizing compliance.
That's really just a really critical point, and it really kind of, I thought, led to another key finding, which was high-performing programs which embrace accountability and transparency will do so even if it means holding senior leaders or those successful performers we talked about earlier accountable for their actions.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, that's where the rubber really hits the road. And there's clearly a ways to go on that. The numbers aren't as robust as one would like to see. And again, that is probably the most difficult thing to accomplish in a program. But if you do that and you're transparent about it, then, you've really strengthened your culture. I'll tell one anecdote from when I was a chief ethics and compliance officer. We had to let go a really senior woman leader. And the rumors went around that she was let go because she was a woman, when in fact there were massive issues with conflict of interest. So we got her boss basically to message her departure, not by name, but by saying, I want to remind everybody, because it's timely, that conflict of interest is an important area of compliance, and here are some things to remember. And we were able to re-message what had happened in a way that made it clear without, violating confidence and whatever, what had happened and why, and that even senior leaders are accountable. And that was powerful.
And then the final point, it really ties into something I heard Lanny Brewer say, I think almost 10 years ago, which was that your compliance program is dynamic. It's not static. It must be constantly evolving. Another way to say is ongoing monitoring is critical, but the criticality is not that you have ongoing monitoring. It's that you use the information that you obtain through the monitoring and loop it back in to improve your compliance program. Because what you guys have found was that high-performing programs constantly evaluate their effectiveness and embrace necessary change. So this seems to really have a long tail behind it.
It does, and it's another really important aspect of how you can move from having sort of a static rules-based program that probably isn't effective to an effective one. One of the things I'm passionate about is I think the importance of benchmarking has gotten overstated, because if you benchmark against another company and you say, oh, that's great, I'm pretty much where they are, you're, again, looking at program elements. You're not looking at cultural dynamics. You're not looking at levels of trust or respect or organizational justice. And so, you tend to then say, great, I'm good to go. But that's not what high-performing programs do. They look at their own data, and we, in fact, have some very interesting tools that really allow you to come up with a cultural heat map. And they say, okay, things are going along. We don't have any regulatory problems at the moment, but we note that there's an uptick in issues arising in our, Australia operations. And they pay attention to that. And then they look for other data as well to see and understand the program. Or if they see people flunking or, let's say, not scoring well on some area of training, or that there's a flurry of questions coming in on the website about a particular policy, they pay attention. And they calibrate their program really using that type of input. And I think that's really what a dynamic program means. It means one that you don't just put it in the closet in the legal department and then trot it out if you have to meet with regulators. It's one where you're really looking for the areas where the program isn't gaining traction. And, a good example of the problems of not doing that are some of the sexual harassment scandals that we've seen in Wells Fargo and others.
If I could pick up on the sort of the sexual harassment, the Me Too, and those, the Weinstein scandal and relating fallout, did the report note that all of these scandals and perhaps others lead you to see some failures in compliance, or at least room for improvement?
Oh, I think it's fair to say failures, sadly. What I see when I read the paper very carefully and read the materials about those is that, again, there were mechanisms to report these issues, and people used them. I mean, they spoke up. But in a number of instances, in some surprising companies where you would expect that there was really better behavior to be had, Fidelity comes to mind, where the CEO is a woman, they were ignored, basically, and nothing was done much. Maybe some coaching, but behavior continued, and it was abusive. Sometimes it was sexual harassment, sometimes it was bullying, or other forms of inappropriate behavior. And there's one athletic gear company where the head of HR personally belittled some of the people bringing complaints. So, it's not enough to have a hotline. It's not enough to have a policy. You have to have, as Dov Seidman, our CEO, would say, moral courage to act upon the issues that come up that way and to truly and thoroughly listen and then take action.
I was wondering if we could perhaps look at some of the areas that really I thought were not as strong and operated or gave us some room for improvement in the section you've entitled E&C Programs in Perspective. So one of the points was that too many organizations still focus really on the rules and procedures, and we've talked about that at some length, but it really seems to be an area for continued improvement opportunities.
I believe it is, and we're actually doing a lot of work with companies now in the area of their policies, because typically the policies have been written by lawyers for lawyers. They're written by outside or inside counsel, and they're defensive in nature. I'm going to say everything there I can possibly think of with respect to the FCPA, anti-corruption, conflict of interest. And then if I get queried by a regulator, I'm going to point to that and say, well, see, it was out on our web and people should have known. But that begs the question as to whether anyone can actually read the policy intelligently and understand what behavior you're trying to influence as a result of it. And as you'll probably admit as a lawyer, lawyers don't always do a good job in that regard. And many policies are just completely unintelligible to non-native speakers or to people who don't come from a regulatory, background. And so, relying on that as your main means of changing behavior is just on its face ridiculous. And again, focusing on values is the way to go. I was just reading a study by one of the English think tanks about behavioral ethics. And yeah, it's good to focus on behavior, but how do you actually get behavior to change? It certainly isn't by just laying on another layer of rules.
Another finding was that, and I certainly agree with this one, too few organizations reward ethical conduct. Under the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, it's called incentives and discipline. And I think a lot of lawyers and compliance practitioners understand the discipline part, but they don't understand or they don't implement the reward or the incentive part. What were you guys seeing?
Yeah, we see the same thing, that it's all sticks and no carrots. And again, if you're going to build an ethical culture, modeling behavior is very important. If you say to the average engineer, and I come from a family of engineers, so I know from where I speak, hey, go be a moral leader and have ethical conversations, they might look at you like, what do you want me to do? And so when people do courageous things, in a prior life, we had a fairly junior F&A person, finance and accounting, who spotted some anomalies in expense reports. And when we looked further, we found there was a major problem of fraud against the company. And so showcasing what that person did, ensuring that they got recognition for that, and they didn't get fired because they rocked the boat. Not that anybody proposed that, but really sort of using that as a model for what you're talking about when you talk about having a good ethical culture. I think that's much more powerful than any list of rules. And similarly, I remember in another company that I worked at, we had a manager who repeatedly said no to a tainted deal, even though his team really wanted to do it. He actually got up on a whiteboard and in front of the other party involved wrote on this, "We're not going to do this. It is tainted." And so showcasing that kind of courage and leadership and example, I just don't know why people don't do it, because it pays huge dividends when you do.
A somewhat dispiriting finding was that less than 49% of ethics and compliance executives say senior leaders in their organizations take responsibility and action regarding compliance failures. How can we maybe work to lessen that number?
Well, I think one of the key ways is to involve more leaders in the process. And, I'm speaking to one of the most prestigious proponents of operationalizing compliance. So I'm sure you'd agree with it that, again, if your compliance program is something that the legal department does, maybe sometimes with the audit department, then you don't have a good program. But if you're actually engaging leaders and helping to educate them on what the risks are, what happens when things go wrong, and what should be done about them, then I think, you have much more of a chance of involving them in taking responsibility and action, for compliance failures. And that, again, is a key to actually operationalizing your compliance program.
And then I was actually also gratified with sort of the next point, because the general topic heading was organizations were really failing to utilize all available tools to identify and remedy misconduct. But you went on to list some of the tools they're not utilizing. So, for instance, compliance practitioners did not have access to data analytics to identify patterns of misconduct or anomalies or red flags, that employees did not have a training program, or did not have a training program that worked on their mobile devices, because that's a key communications tool now, that compliance was not a part of a pre-acquisition due diligence initiative. They would certainly be brought on after an initiative, or after a closing, I should say, but they're not utilized for the due diligence part beforehand. So there's really lots of different tools and services that the compliance department could bring, and they're not having the opportunity to utilize.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, again, as I read about the various failures that are unfolding in the press, some of this is not rocket science. I mean, having training that works on your mobile device makes sense, and it accords a certain level of respect to your employees to do that, and convenience, or including ethics and compliance on the front end of mergers and acquisitions, and using data analytics to really look at data. Sometimes I see people throw up their hands and say, I don't know how to change my culture. But, a long journey starts with one step, and even just doing some of these things can start you on the right path.
So near the end of the report, you've got several points on the path forward, but I guess the one that struck me, I should say, the most when I read the report, and it stuck with me now that I've had the opportunity to visit with you in this podcast, is it's really about shaping behavior and not laying on the rules. And if I could go back to one point you said earlier, which was companies which stress values are better at operationalizing compliance. And that sentence seemed to me to really sum it up, because the DOJ talks about operationalizing your compliance. Well, what you're telling us is, if you stress the values, the operationalization part will either come or be almost embedded within your organization de facto.
Well, I really believe that, and there's a excellent example, although it's a disturbing example, and that's some of the very public travails of United Airlines, where the rule book for gate agents on who can stay on planes and who can't and who gets bumped is several inches thick. In fact, I think I saw something from the CEO recently that said it was about 5 pounds. But everybody knows what happened last summer when a doctor was forcibly dragged off the plane. And yes, okay, the rules may have said that was the right thing to do, but it wasn't the right thing to do. And there was a value there that got lost in following the rules. And similarly, when the poor puppy died, when a flight attendant put it in an overhead bin, the damage you do to your image and the lack of trust that creates and all is just inestimable. And So again, focusing on values, on doing the right thing, even if you're not legally required to do that thing, but it's the right thing, then, that is much more effective than saying, hey, we have to look up Chapter 9, Section 51.5 to see what we have to do here. You do need a framework of rules, as you know, in a company, but focusing people on values not only gives them the right orientation, but it motivates them to do the right thing.
Well, Susan, if someone wanted to either download a copy of the report or get more information about LRN, could you suggest where they may go?
Sure. Our website, Tom, www.lrn.com, and the report, which we call the Program Effectiveness Index Report, is easy to find. And also my email is susan.divers@lrn.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it anytime.
So I've been visiting with Susan Divers. It's been a fascinating discussion about the 2018 LRN Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report. A lot of great information on here, a lot of great detail, a lot of great suggestions on how you can improve your compliance program. Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Tom, it was a true pleasure as always.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out even further afield about the top podcast in compliance. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for joining me this week, and I hope you join me again next week where we take up another compliance-related topic. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.